Welcome to Legacy Sips and Tips podcast with your geeky host, Lindsay Wheeler, where we talk about everything from death, preparing for your future through estate planning, life, the occasional breakup, entrepreneurship, general nerdery, and of course travel, snowboard, and always wine. Welcome to Legacy Sips and Tips with your host, Lindsay, and today we're going to have an episode all about your favorite thing and mine, wine. Today we have on our episode Ben Parrott. He is a winemaker, and we're going to discuss the wonderful world of wine. Thank you for being on my show.
Thank you.
I'm so nervous. So your name is Ben Parrott. You are a winemaker. How long have you been a winemaker for?
I've been working in wine for 24 years.
It's a long time. How old are you?
46.
That's pretty old. How did you get into wine production? Like, what made you just go, I'm going to be a winemaker? Is that something you grew up, like, going to school being like, when they asked you if you want to be a fireman, a police officer, an astronomer, you're like, no, I'm going to be the winemaker?
No, I wanted to fly planes when I was young, but I grew up in St. Helena in the Napa Valley, and kind of one of those things where you just kind of get into it by default, I guess. A lot of my friends worked harvests in the wine industry, and I think that, it's kind of at that age, an easy way to make money on a short term, not a full-time job. It's, you work during the summer and through October, and then you take your paycheck and go snowboarding, which is what I did. And then eventually, after a couple rounds of that, I decided that was something I wanted to stick to and kind of caught the bug with it. And my mentor at the time told me, if you want to stick to this, you should probably take some schooling for it. So I ended up going through UC Davis and got my Enology Viticulture degree, and here I am.
Who is your mentor?
Ken Dice.
And where did he work? What is his story?
He was a winemaker at Flora Springs in St. Helena for 30 years, and then he kind of semi-retired and did some stuff at Naked Wines, and then now he's fully retired. That's
cool. And you are good friends with the family of them?
Yeah. I grew up with his son as my best friend when we were kids, but when we were kids, it was kind of like, what does your dad do? Makes wine? Cool, let's go ride bikes, play basketball. Didn't register what that meant at that age, but looking back on it, like, he's a really talented winemaker, and I'm really glad that he kind of pushed me and put me under his wing, and I learned a lot from him, and I still ask him questions on occasion when I get stuck, so it's nice to have that in my portfolio. But he's just a very knowledgeable, cool guy.
Well, he's one of kind of like the people that put Napa on the map, weren't they?
Yeah, he's a very awarded winemaker. His wines are amazing.
Do you feel like you work with him every day while you're at work? Like, you think, oh, what did he would do here? What would he do there? And
yeah, I do sometimes think about in my mind, like, well, in this situation, what would Ken do? And it's always a good thought to think about, because it's nice to have somebody else, that's not my own brain, to guide my own brain.
So how does schooling work for that? So a lot of people don't understand how that is. Like, I'll have people talk to me about you, and they're like, oh, that's so cute, he makes wine. And I'm like, no, he actually makes the wine you buy at the grocery store. He makes the wine that you buy at the wineries you go visit. So what does schooling look like for that, and how does somebody get into that industry, if you will?
I started by cleaning barrels and washing tanks and stuff, just kind of a cellar rat. And then with schooling, I guess you would just decide if you want to do that or not. Most people 18 years old, legally can't even drink wine. So thinking about that in high school or something right out of that, going into college after high school, is probably not on everybody's top list, unless your parents push you, be a doctor, a lawyer, or a winemaker, I guess in Napa anyway. But for me, it was kind of one of those things where I worked for a while and then ended up, like I said, Ken kind of pushed me to take some classes. So I was able to take the things that I'd done and then learn why I was doing those things. So my degree is basically a kind of a fancy titled chemistry degree. There was a lot of math and a lot of chemistry. Everyone asked me, oh, did you swirl wine? I said, yeah, both clockwise and counterclockwise. So they're, kind of the joke. But, a lot of it wasn't really hands-on winemaking. There's a lot of theoretical stuff, a lot of chemistry, and a lot of just understanding how components of wine interact with each other and produce a product that's not just rotten grape juice and it's not just vinegar. So you try to make it so it's delicious, it's something that people can save. It's like not many foods we can drink 10 years or eat 10 years later, maybe cheese, but I think wine's kind of a fun thing where you can save some, you can kind of have a library, you can see how those wines were at that time and then watch them progress over time.
So you said it's a bachelor's degree. It's a normal degree, but it's a science degree, right? But it's in enology and viticulture.
Yeah.
But then I think for your schooling, right, it would branch off into different components. So what do those look like for schooling?
Yeah, you could. I mean, at Davis, you could kind of take some specialty direction. You could do sales. You could do the winemaking side as production, and then you could do the viticulture side, which is the grape growing. I was more interested in the grape growing, so I actually did the winemaking and the viticulture side together. Kind of combined my classes to get both knowledge in those two areas. The sales is not for me. I don't do well talking, obviously, with other people, but it wasn't something that really interested me. But kind of a side note on that, when we started, when we had this orientation in this auditorium, the president of the viticulture and enology program stood up and said, "Look, you guys, not all of you are going to be winemakers. Some of you are going to sell corks, bottles, barrels, foils, closures, whatever." So don't think it's all fun and games and red carpets and helicopter rides. And literally about half the people got up and left. Like, it was very interesting. So there was probably 300 people, and then at the end it was 150. And then when I graduated, we had 64 people.
And so I think that's kind of the misconception. People think, oh, I'm a winemaker, or I work in the vineyards, or I work in a winery, and I'm in Napa, and yeah, I have a helicopter, and people come to my vineyards, and that's, I looked into it, of what it does, and for even their continuing education, like their certificate school, like they're like, oh, a winemaker averagely makes about $75K a year, and everyone's like, and I'll see my way out, because you think you're going to be this rock star or something, and you're going to have Lady Gaga coming there, and even though that they do come to your wineries, but it's not like you're hanging out with them, they're just here to buy your product.
I did hang out with Lady Gaga at the winery, which was interesting that you say that, but yeah, I think the days of the rock star winemakers are pretty over. It's not something you get into for money. It's something you get into for passion. For me, I like the art and the science combination. Your cat's about to jump on the table.
That's what she does.
But yeah, I think that, if you're getting into it for money, then you're getting it for the wrong reasons, and that's not really, a good idea, because you're going to be disappointed with that. So you get more satisfaction, I think, out of the finished product than you do out of the paycheck.
So how does that work? So you have like you said, the dual degree. So tell us about because we drive and we look at the vineyards, and we're like, oh, it's so pretty, and there's grapes growing there, but not a lot of people understand what that is, how that works. What does that management look like for a vineyard? Because it's an agricultural product. It's like you have apples, or you have lemons, or you have spinach,
It's similar to a lot of agriculture in that aspect, especially those kind of orchards, because you don't replant grapevines every time you want grapes. You plant the vine, and then there's vines on earth that are hundreds of years old. And off the top of my head, I can't remember the oldest one. I think it's in England somewhere in a greenhouse. But yeah, I mean, you can grow it for a long time. But it's kind of like, you think about the lifespan of it. It's producing well for about 25 years, and then most people will replant to get that. You want your harvest to not go down to half a ton an acre when you were getting 4 or 5 tons an acre, because economically that doesn't make sense. But it is very similar, I think, to orchard crops and those types of things, where you manage your soil, you manage your water, and you manage kind of the canopy and the pruning, if you will, so it's not overgrown. I'm sure we've all seen vineyards that you're looking at it, goes, that one looks a little unique compared to other vineyards I've seen, and a lot of times that's either something that people have forgotten or can't afford to have the labor come in and prune. There's different aspects of the laborers involved is a whole another topic, but there's countries that don't have actual labor that can come in and help with that. So they have machines, or they just, 2 people do it over the course of months, just depending. But I think, for me, just being more interested in nature, I think that was kind of a side appeal to doing viticulture instead of just the production of winemaking. All right, Kat. Well, hang on. But yeah, no, I enjoy that aspect too, because every year it's different. You get different weather, you get different harvests, you get different problems, and then everything you remember or you try to keep track of or you learned goes out the window on the next harvest, because it'll be totally different set of problems, whether it's drought, whether it's too much rain, too many cats.
Too many cats.
It just depends, I think, on personal preference. But
so talk about that a little bit. So that's why we have vintages or years for our wine, because that's when it's produced. And so explain that to people, because I don't think people understand what the year means on there so much, or like what the AVA means, or any of the kind of things that we look at, or what makes unique wines.
So the date or the vintage on the bottle itself is the year that the grapes were harvested. not that the year the wine was made, but usually they're made in the same year. Obviously, you're not going to refrigerate grapes for 10 years before you make wine out of it. So the vintage is the designate of when it was harvested. The AVA, or American Viticulture Area, on it is the designation of where those grapes were grown. And there's legal definitions of what those actually are. So you'll see boundaries on maps, and they go anywhere from huge down to very tiny, depending on climate, geography, the topography. There's different aspects that you can kind of ask for when you apply to do a new AVA in the United States. And I'm not an expert on the rest of the world, but most of the world have some sort of category where that is a designation, whether it's the DOCG or, Controlli, Appellation Controlli, or just AVA in the United States.
So that lets people know kind of where these grapes were sourced from.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's interesting. So how many AVAs are there in Napa area itself? That's a lot, right?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't really know. I know there's been a few since I lived there. I want to say there's around 20, but don't quote me on that.
Which is crazy in a small geographic area that you have different climates and different topography and different soils that would create or allow for that AVA to be created.
Right. Yeah. I mean, like I said, you can go all the way big from just Napa Valley, which kind of encompasses all of it. But then you got the little ones, like, going from basically north to south. You got Calistoga, St. Helena, Rutherford, Oakville, Yountville, all the way down to Carneros, which is the southern kind of western side of the Napa Valley. And then there's other ones kind of scattered throughout, some up in the hills. You got on this side, you got Diamond Mountain, you got Mount Veeder, you got a couple of them, and then going on the other side, you got Howell Mountain, you got Atlas Peak. There's, so basically, yeah, back to what I was saying, it's based on topography. So whether it be elevation or whether it be this peak to that creek to that, soil, that's how they would make the boundaries on an AVA.
That's interesting. And then who does that? Who says I have a vineyard of? Is it you have to have amount of acreage? Is it what you grow there? Like, what makes that determination, and who makes that determination?
You have to have 5 acres to legally have a winery. You can grow grapes to sell them, but you can't do an estate that way. So you would basically apply to the TTB,
which is
the Tax Trade Bureau. So basically, you would say, hey, I want to make a new AVA, and then it probably goes through the agriculture. I can't off the top of my head. I'm having a brain fart with that one. What do you call it?
The Department of Agriculture?
Yeah, whatever it is, the main body of those people, they probably review your request and see, okay, does it have this uniqueness, or is there a significant difference between the neighbor's yard and your yard that makes you part of the AVA and not them? Because a lot of that goes on in Napa, where they're going, hey, what about us? We're only 10 steps from that guy's border, but we're not included in that AVA, even if the soil's the same or even if the climate's the same. So there's probably a little bit of political going on as well. I'm not an expert in that, nor do I care, but I think it's just something that people can have a sense of pride in what they're doing, where they're doing it. And then as a consumer, you also can say, hey, I really like fruit from this, or wine, per se, from this area versus this area, or I like elevation when I'm drinking wine rather than valley floor, and so on and so forth. And I think that's kind of the beauty of it, is that you can find something that fits your preference, I guess, as far as what wines you like. And then you can go, hey, if I like something this side of the east facing or west facing, and it's at this elevation, then you can look throughout the world and say, hey, that makes sense, I like that wine because that's grown on a hillside in Italy or whatever. So you can kind of associate your preferences to where and how it's grown.
That's interesting. What does it look like when you work in the vineyard? Like, I don't think people understand that. Like I said, they roll up to this winery, they're, oh, look at how pretty it is, but they don't really understand like the actual agricultural aspect of it, what goes into it. So I know in the United States we're allowed to water our crops, where in other regions of the world they're not. So what does that look like for us, and how does that play into our crops?
Well, it kind of allows grapes to be grown in places they normally wouldn't grow naturally, or in a healthy way. It takes about 8 inches a year to grow a vine.
8 inches of water?
Of rain, yeah, per year. So you got to start them out. And a lot of those countries that don't allow irrigation do allow you to water baby vines until they're established, till the roots can get down into either the water table or to deep enough where the water is not evaporating in an arid climate, for example. But in the United States, yeah, I mean, you can get 10 tons an acre in Lodi and water the crap out of it. And, then meanwhile, there's other places that have not a good access to water, and they're not getting that kind of a yield. So I don't want to use the word cheating, but I think it benefits the farmer to have unlimited irrigation potential if you are able to afford it, and then if you have that resource available in your area as well. So places that are wet, they're not as worried about it, or places that have runoff, like in the Andes, for example, they're not really worried about getting drip irrigation out there. But kind of the arid places in the United States even are shipping in water or rerouting rivers and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, it takes a lot of water to grow grapes, and fortunately it's seasonal, so you're not using water throughout the year, like as in most agriculture, obviously seasonal, but the vines do go dormant in the winter, and you're not watering during those times. Hopefully, fingers crossed, you get a good amount of rain so the soil's saturated, so when the vines wake up in the spring, they have enough water to grow through their life cycle where you're not having to water them down. Because if you think about adding a lot of water to something agricultural, like an apple, for example, a lot of water means a big apple. That looks great, but the flavor is going to be watery. So with grapes, we try to say, hey, a struggling vine makes better quality. So we try not to, there's a lot of people that purposefully dry farm, even if they have access to water or irrigation. And the irrigation is more of a backup. You can have that on years that are really bad, or let's say 5 years in a row of drought. Your vines are going to start to show that, and you're going to want to water them. But
so it's like a fine line of getting the grapes to grow with a little bit of struggle, so then all their energy goes into the fruit itself to make it sweet and nice and what you want.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, because a lot of places you can continue to water through harvest time and keep those grapes on the vine, which gives you some maturity, but at the same time you're kind of
diluting their process.
A little bit, yeah. You're diluting it, or you're slowing it down.
That's interesting. So you as a winemaker, so then you get this harvest, and what is a typical time in the U.S. for harvest?
In the northern hemisphere, it's usually basically early August. Sometimes for people that produce sparkling or some more of the acidic varieties, through probably the end of October, sometimes all the way into November. If you're talking to folks that grow ice wine, like for example in Canada, they're probably pulling in obviously when it's freezing out, so January, February. So it just depends on where you are, but in general, it's that kind of August to, let's just say, December. And then, prior to that, the vines are growing, and after that, the vines lose all their leaves and they become dormant, and then we'll prune and wait till the cycle repeats.
But primarily, it's like in August to October, like in like
California,
Napa area,
yeah.
California
in California
area.
especially, it's mid-August to mid-October, late October.
And what's like usually the first to and how do you determine when you want to harvest? It's not like an apple or something, and you're like, oh, it's green now, or it's red, it's good to go.
I mean, I'm sure apple farmers taste the fruit, make sure it tastes sweet so you can sell it. You don't want to give everybody a bellyache giving them acidic apples. But with grapes, it starts out like any other fruit, unripe, and it doesn't taste great. And there's, you can do things like make verjus and these kind of products where it's acidity that you're adding to, like, for example, a salad dressing that's not vinegar. So you get really tart grape juice. Then as the grape matures, it goes through what's called veraison. It changes colors, and then you get the ripeness. And everybody's had a raisin. That's as ripe as a grape gets. So there's a window, really. And the way I describe it is, as sugar is going up, acid's coming down. And somewhere when you harvest that, there's a balance of acid to sugar. And then you can get a good balanced wine that's not too acidic or not too alcoholic or not too sweet. I like to make wines that are spheres, that don't have anything poking out, because if something's poking out, that's all you taste, whether it be oaky or acidity or tannin or sugar or alcohol. That throws the balance off. So I think when you're looking at the grapevine, you're tasting what nature gives you. You make sure that has the good numbers that you're looking for, whether it be sugar or titratable acidity and those types of things. Then you can go into the winery and turn that into a good quality wine with a little bit more manipulation, basically.
And as a winemaker, who do you work with in the vineyards to make sure that this is happening? Do you personally go out and do that, or?
So normally most wineries have a vineyard manager, or most vineyards, I should say, have a vineyard manager that does the actual spraying, trellising, pruning, replanting, maybe ripping them out when they're older, or if they're not producing, or if they die, which happens. So normally those people are just focused 100% on the vineyard. The winemaker steps in when it's closer to harvest, and they're able to dictate when those grapes are harvested. So then you can tell your vineyard manager, hey, we're going to want to pick this in a week or two. And then the vineyard manager can organize labor to come pick it, or at least bring in tractors if they're machine harvesting it on time. So you're not too early, you're not too late. But it's hard too, because a lot of the vineyard management companies have multiple vineyards. So if everybody wants to pick next Tuesday, it's going to be rough on that guy to try to make that happen for 10 different vineyards. So there's like I said, a little bit of a window, I think, for when grapes are considered perfect for winemaking, and you try to get it in that window.
And how does that look? Do you go out there and you taste them? Are you picking them?
Yeah,
Are you making wine from them? What does that
My
process look like?
palate's my best tool. I can taste them and see that there's a balance in there. But there are a lot of tools that you can use to look at the numbers. The main one's called a refractometer, and you basically put juice on a little slide, if you will, and you look, and light shines through that, and the amount of light bending will dictate how much solids they're in. And usually when we're talking solids, it's the amount of sugar that is in the liquid. You can also use a hydrometer, which people use, to test the densities of liquids, and that also can give you the number. We measure in something called Brix, and Brix is basically the amount of dissolved sugar in the liquid.
And why do we want sugar in there? Because when we drink alcohol, we don't taste sugar primarily, unless it's like a sweet, I don't know, like a sweet wine. Like, explain that to people, because a lot of people don't understand what that means.
So to get alcohol, you have to have sugar. So yeast converts sugar into alcohol, ethanol, if you will, and carbon dioxide, and a few other metabolites. But those are the main. And so the higher your sugar is, the higher your alcohol will be. But then there's a lot of factors with that. That's a kind of a complicated question. But in general, higher your sugar, the higher your alcohol. Yeast have alcohol tolerances, so you're not going to be able to ferment a 90 proof whiskey just off of your grain that you've harvested, or making a brandy naturally. So wine yeasts, as opposed to, let's say, like Fleischmann's bread yeast, can tolerate up to 16-18% alcohol by volume. Where bread yeast, if you tried to make wine or beer out of it, you're going to get a maximum of about 4% alcohol, because it just kills itself. Alcohol being its metabolite will actually poison the environment and be too strong for it to survive. And so yeast is actually kind of a weird animal / plant, where it buds, but as the buds come out, then makes a new yeast cell. It still has to tolerate the environment that the previous generation has left. So if there's too much alcohol, and also yeast makes heat, if there's too much heat, for example, they're not going to survive as well. So the higher the sugar, the higher your alcohol, the higher the heat, the higher the fermentation. So in the winery, I should say, we manage jacket temperatures on the tanks to keep that cap cool, so it's not overheating. We also manage, like I said, that sugar level at harvest, so we're not getting wines that are 18% alcohol, even though there's Zinfandel fans out there that like those high octane wines, which that's personal preference. But I think for a balanced wine, you don't want it to be hot, and hot is the term we used for a high alcohol wine. Feel it warms your belly.
Yeah. So talk about the different types of wine that people drink. So we have a lot of white wine drinkers, like our, housewives and the ladies who like just their whites, and then rosés is a big hip happening thing now, and then we go into our reds. So tell us a little bit about the differences, or sweet wines and sparklings and fortifieds. Like, what do those all mean to people?
So there's thousands of grape varieties out there, and some of them have pigment in the skins, and some of them do not. In most vitis vinifera, which are the European grape vines that we make most wines out of, all the juices are actually clear. So you can see, like, everybody's heard of white zin, and that's basically it's a Zinfandel, which is a red grape. It's pressed without having skin contact, so that pigment does not go into the wine.
What does it mean when you press? Like, so we'll go. I guess we'll go through the whole winemaking process, but
sure.
Yeah, we'll talk about what pressing means for them.
So it's kind of like making tea or coffee, for example. If you just pour water through it, you're going to have a light. The drip coffee is going to be pretty light. If you soak it like a French press and let that have contact in the liquid, it's going to extract more of those phenols and components, if you will, of the coffee or tea, and make it taste stronger or more astringent or bitter or whatever it is. So yeah, the same thing with wine. So there's grapes that have no pigment, so Chardonnay or Sauvignon Blanc, those kind of wines that are popular with people that like white wine. You're not getting any color because the skins themselves don't have any color. But if you wanted to make a white wine, and sparkling you mentioned is a good example of that, you see Blanc de Blanc, which is white from white. That's white juice coming out of a white grape. You see Blanc de Noir, that's white juice that's just pressed. So you take the red grapes, you squeeze them, the clear juice comes out. It gets a little bit of color, so you can see some pink. So yeah, like I was saying, the skin, the color of wine mostly comes from the skin. There are some grape varieties out there that do have colored juice. Those are illegal to make wine out of in the United States because they considered it cheating back in the old days, and that kind of held over that law. There's some that are bred from those grapes that are crossed with vinifera, and you can use some of those, like Alicante Bouschet is a good example of that type of a wine. So the juice still is red, but you still leave it on the skins to get a little more complexity from tannins and the, more color from those kind of wines.
So so let's go into like the actual process of making wine. So you have a vineyard, you've got some grapes growing, you're like, okay, great. Now we looked at our levels and now we're going to harvest now. So then what's that whole process look like for the next however long?
So basically, in a nutshell, the grapes are harvested, brought into the winery, and then processed. And depending on the type of wine you're making, the process will differ. So for example, as your previous question with whites and reds, whites go directly into the press. And the press is basically a big bladder that fills with air and squeezes the grapes against the side. And the side is actually like a strainer, so just juice comes out, pulp stays in. We use that same press in red winemaking just later in the process. So in red winemaking process, you put all the skins and seeds and not the stems, we go through a destemmer, but basically you make a wine grape soup. So this big pulpy mess, and then you ferment that. And once that is dry, once the sugar has been used by the yeast and the alcohol levels are where they're going to be and there's no more sugar left for the yeast, then we throw that in the press, squeeze it against the side, and then that red juice comes out. In the example of a white Zin, you would do it just like the whites. You'd put the red grapes in the press, squeeze it, clear juice would come out, even though it has a little pink tint, and that's what you would ferment. So whites and rosés. Rosés are a little bit of skin contact. Sometimes you just roll the press a couple times. So every time you squeeze the bladder, you deflate the bladder, then you roll it. So basically this cake that's stuck to the side of the press now can kind of crumble down, fall apart, get another squeeze, and you can squeeze basically we go up to maybe 1.2 bars, 1.4 bar, depending on that's atmospheres of pressure. Each one's about 14.5 psi. So, you squeeze to 28 psi, you're squeezing at 2 atmospheres, and that's pretty hard. You can break some seeds, and you can get some bitter notes from that. So we try to be as gentle as possible on the pressing, but also at the same time, you want to extract as much juice as you can out of those grapes too. So economically, it's worth keep on making your wine out of that vineyard. But yeah, I think process-wise, you add yeast. The yeast turns the sugar in the grapes, as we've talked about, into alcohol. The time sitting on those skins gives that wine its color in the example of reds. Then you press that wine. The wine is now just finished wine. There's a little pulp in it because it obviously goes through a little bit on that strainer side of the press. That's when you stick it into a barrel, and over the next 2 years is usually the average. Some people do 3 years. You're going to rack that. So everything settles out by gravity. You'll have a layer on the bottom of the barrel. You're going to take the clean wine from above that layer. Usually you use a wand that has a little kind of like a spike that you can adjust. Usually you have a little sight glass so you can see if you're actually sucking up any pulp. So you want clear juice. If you see pulp, you pull it back up so you're not sucking pulp. Once all that clean wine's out, you can rinse that barrel, get all that sediment back out of the barrel, put the wine back in it, and repeat that multiple times. So some people will rack 4 or 5 times. Most people rack maybe 2 or 3 times just because it is labor intensive. And I think if you beat the wine up or move it around too much or introduce oxygen to it too much, there's some flaws that can occur. But in general, that's kind of the basis of wine production. And then once it's aged to your specifications, whether it be clarity, whether it be smoothness of the tannins, whether it be just blending or overall you didn't make enough this year, you got to combine it with the next barrel. There's a lot of variables there, but those will be bottled, and then your wine's ready for consumers to set. And then that goes into a whole other thing of, do you age it in the bottle? And some people do. Some collectors will sit it for years, and there are benefits on aging wine in the bottle, but in general, most wineries will produce a wine out of the barrel to bottle that is pretty much drinkable, and then that leaves it up to your personal preference if you want to continue to age it and allow it to mature or not.
So we're right now in 2024. So if I'm at the grocery store and I'm going around and I see a red wine that's 2023, should I be concerned?
No, because there's a lot of wines that are produced within the same year, and again, it depends on style that you're after or personal preference. Wines that are meant purposefully to be consumed very young are kind of thrown through that process that I just mentioned more quickly, and other wines, I think, benefit from aging. So it depends on the type of wine it is. If you were going to drink a big Cabernet and it was only a year old, I would say maybe put that down for a couple of years so it allows it to kind of mature. But something like a Beaujolais or even like a Pinot, something lighter, they're usually good to go.
Interesting.
But again, it depends on personal preference. Some people prefer more mature wines, and some people prefer younger wines.
Yeah. So we're going to the holiday times. You know, people are bringing wine or wanting to bring wine to events or family dinners and things like that. So what should I'm brand new. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm going to the grocery store. I'm going to whatever it is, Total Wine or something. What should I be looking for to bring to a nice event?
So I'm a winemaker, not a sommelier. It's up to really the consumer on that. But kind of just to cover that side of the wine world, everybody hears about doing red wine with red meat or white wine with fish, and that seems to be a pretty good rule of thumb for most people, because in my world, when I'm cooking and when I'm drinking wine, I want to pair the body of the wine with the body of the food. I don't necessarily think about it as the color of the wine with the color of the meat, for example. So in general, I think that's an easy rule of thumb. Do whites with light fare and do big reds with heavy fare, creams and these types of things. But as you look around the world, you can see the different countries that have different types of food usually make wines that kind of match their food. For example, Italy's wines are pretty acidic and pretty light, and they're usually doing some pretty, pastas and acidic tomato sauces and cheeses. France, they use a lot of butter and a lot of cream, so their wines are a little bit heavier, and those kind of dictate going along with that, kind of matches a little better. The white wine and fish thing, I think, works pretty well. Fish is usually pretty light and not too fatty, depending on what kind of sauce you're putting on it. But I've had some really nice reds with some really fatty salmon, so it depends. But I think as a consumer, just going and keeping your mind open is, do you like a certain wine already? So stick to what you like. I think that's a good advice for most people. But then at the same time, kind of branch out a little bit and don't get the wine blinders. Coming from Napa, everything's Cabernet and Chardonnay. That's fun, but I think that, it kind of limits you on what you can eat, and then, it also limits you on your knowledge of other wines and your interest in moving forward on trying other wines.
So people shouldn't be stressed out of like, oh,
Nah.
I'm having a cod today. I need to have a white wine. I must find a white wine.
Right.
You can open a red and maybe even a heavy red and just be like, that is what it is. I mean, there's the components of wine pairing, if you will. Is it salty? Is it sweet? Is it umami? Is it acidic?
Right. Yeah, and I mean, and back to going around the world, it's like, you can have fish and chips, but it's better with a beer, or you can have tacos and it's probably better with a margarita. Like it's just different. I think as far as what you're making and what you're drinking. But as long as you're drinking wine, that makes me happy as a winemaker, because I'm selling you wine. But as if you talk to a sommelier, they're probably going to explain to you how the tannin structure and proteins bind. So you want to decant it, you want to let them mature, and there's so many things with that as well. It's a whole nother conversation, but just in general, don't stress on it. Like, buy a wine that you like already, so it's going to be good. And then if you don't, maybe if you say, hey, I really like so-and-so's Merlot, then maybe try X, Y, and Z Merlot, if Merlot's your thing. Or, if you like Merlot, then maybe you want to try another kind of lighter styled red wine. You can go into the Barberas or the, Pinots, or just, there's so many different wines. Like, as I said, there's thousands of varieties of wine. So I think that trying to tell yourself that there's a specific wine for a specific food kind of is overwhelming. And I think that can become an issue, really, rather than just, hey, this wine wasn't that good. Oh, well, glad we tried it, right? Scratch that off our list.
And then, should people be concerned about price points as well? Like, I mean, if I'm looking at a $5 bottle of wine versus a 30 versus 100, like, what dictates the price of wine?
A lot of things do, I think, in my opinion, but I think really, I think for people who are getting into wine, obviously you're not going to go spend $200 on a bottle of wine that someone told you was fancy and amazing, because that's really out of your budget for something you're experimenting with. Because what if you don't like it at all? Then you're out $200. But at the same side of that coin, the $2 wines everyone's heard of, those they're drinkable, but I think that you start to get into, I don't know, you start to taste more of the vinegary flavors, and you see the quality, I think. And obviously a producer is going to get as much as they can for that wine, so they want to make the best wine they can to get the most amount of money for that wine. But yeah, just be careful. I think in my world, as a normal person, between the $15 and $35 range at the grocery store, those wines tend to be pretty good quality. You go above that and it starts to become what I call my special occasion wines. So you're not going to be drinking those on a Tuesday night, but maybe on your birthday or anniversary, or giving a nice gift, or going out to a nice dinner with your boss or something along those lines. The really cheapo depot wines are probably going to be more of like your third bottle of the night if you're feeling that, kind of little want to open another one because you're kind of buzzy. The worst thing is you wake up in the morning and your recycle bin's full of $100 bottles and you're going, man, I don't even remember the third one. So I think there's kind of a time and a place for each of those categories of wine costs. But in general, it's, there's legal limits of a lot of things that can go into the bottle. So the cheaper stuff's probably pushing those legal limits, where the more expensive stuff is probably using very expensive techniques and tools to avoid those higher numbers. For example, volatile acidity or vinegar. Obviously, you don't want to pay $100 for a bottle of vinegar unless you purposefully are buying some aged balsamic of some sort. But a lot of wines I think just have, I guess in the moral of the story is the quality of the wine doesn't necessarily reflect the cost of the wine, or vice versa. The cost isn't going to necessarily mean it's a really nice bottle of wine. So I've had really expensive bottles that I don't like, and I've had really cheap bottles that I think are amazing, and they could probably charge 3 times as much. But again, it just depends on the producer and the kind of wine that they're selling and the volume that they're selling as well.
Yeah, so people shouldn't be turned off where they're like, oh, doesn't seem like it's very quality because it's cheaper, but
Right. I mean, you think in general across the board, especially in California, the price per acre of farming is pretty much the same. It's not going to be, just because this wine's $300 a bottle and this wine's $15 a bottle, diesel for the tractor is the same, labor costs per hour are the same. So these guys might make 2,000, cases, and these guys might make 20 cases. So their profit margins try to maintain, the logic of farming that acre. But yeah, I would say don't stress out on it. Don't, again, do what's comfortable within your budget as well. That's important. Don't splurge on something because you think it's going to be fancy.
Yeah. Because I've had people bring me because they think I'm uppity, and they'll bring me like what they think is a nice wine, and it might be a lower price point, and it's fantastic. And a lot of these wineries, I think, that have the lower price points do that because they do in bulk. They do big batches of it, so they can make consistent wine that is affordable, like the Barefoots or the Ménage à Trois, or the what's the other one that is a good one that I use for sangria. Like there's those wineries too that are huge that make them in bigger batches so they can afford to drop that price point. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think a good example of that is the tier system within a winery. So, for example, if I'm going to put my wine in a French barrel, that French barrel is going to cost me $1,500. So I'm going to have to, make it. I'm going to have to basically make sure that I'm going to get that money back from using that barrel. So the wine that comes from that barrel is going to be more expensive.
So it's $1,500 per barrel that you guys are using?
Mm-hmm,
oh, that's
French,
expensive. Yeah.
For French, yeah. So, and it depends on the cooper. You can buy cheaper, but just in this example, so let's say we make 1,000 gallons of a Cabernet. Half of it goes into these French barrels. The other half doesn't. The other half can go as our second tier, or maybe a little bit cheaper, because it doesn't have the cost of production that the French barrels are going to include with that. So even though they're the same wine, the same vineyard, the same grape, this wine's going to have a totally different, a significantly different aspect because of that cost of barrels and the flavor too. So you're going to see that oak, you're going to see more of that, where barrels in general are very expensive. So a lot of wineries kind of stick to the 20-25% new oak. The rest are neutral, and neutral barrels mean they've already been new. They're no longer imparting any oak flavor. So after about 2 years or usages or 2 years of aging of the wine, they're not giving big oak flavors or big oak tannins or any of that kind of stuff. So they're what we call a neutral barrel, and those are just a container. But since it's made out of wood, it's porous, so it allows the wine to breathe, kind of like people that decant their wines, it breathes a little bit, so it softens it up. So if we can afford to, you buy a couple new barrels every year and you keep your old barrels, so that way you can put all your wine in barrels. Some wineries can't afford that or don't have the space, or that's just not an option where they are. They'll keep it in stainless steel, which doesn't breathe, which doesn't allow that softening. But again, it saves you costs, so those wines might be more affordable to the average person.
Let's go ahead and open some wine so we can show everybody how to properly open a bottle, or, therefore, or thereabouts, the different type of openers, the different type of glasses. We just have red ones here, but they're all different. There's hundreds of different types of glasses for wine.
Yeah, so I'll start by just talking about the foil here. So back in the old days, these used to be made out of lead, and lead obviously is not good for us. So when I open a bottle, I cut it below, and it's kind of the tradition. You cut it below the neck, the lip there. A lot of those little fancy foil cutters that you'll see that sit on the top and spin it will cut it on the top of the lip. Again, just as tradition, you don't want to pour wine through a lead. These are not made out of lead, by the way, anymore. These are tin, and a lot of them are actually poly plastics. But anyway, I do that to keep tradition. It kind of looks nice too. Before I use this one, a corkscrew, I'll actually show you the butler's friend. The reason they call it that because it doesn't put a hole in your cork, so the butler can drink some wine out of your cellar without you knowing. Most people don't use these because they're ridiculously difficult. You kind of just rock it in, kind of back and forth as it goes down. Once it gets down, you can twist the cork and the cork will come up. So that's how those work. I'm not going to take it out all the way because I'll show you the corkscrew. Corkscrew, I think most people are familiar with just because they're so easy to use. So you just screw it down in, the corkscrew itself goes through the cork, and then you kind of use the sidebar to kind of cantilever it out. And that's basically how to open a bottle of wine. But the reason, like I said, to cut it below there is just for tradition, and you don't necessarily have to. These are not lead, like I said, so you're not going to die if you don't do that. But that's just me.
And so when you open it, should you be looking at the cork? Should we be looking at the bottle?
Yeah,
What
I mean, make sure your
at?
cork's not falling apart. If it's really, really dry, the reason we store wine on its side or upside down is so it keeps contact with the cork, because the cork is also an oak product. It comes from the bark of an oak tree. And to keep it moist will allow it to kind of maintain its integrity, if you will.
From an oak tree?
It is.
Not a cork tree?
It's a cork oak, yes.
Oh, okay.
But the species is an oak tree.
Did not know that.
But yeah, so if you keep it wet, it'll kind of maintain its elasticity and it'll keep a good seal against the side of the bottle. So yeah, to answer your question, looking at a cork right off the bat, if it's crumbling, you're going to know this was probably stored neck up and the cork dried out. Once the cork's dry, it allows a lot of oxygen in. You'll see the ullage, or the level of your wine, go down because of evaporation, and also having more oxygen in there will basically allow some bugs to live in there and turn it into vinegar. So that's unfortunately
bugs is in bacteria, not
bacteria.
As in like actual bugs.
Not as in crawling bugs with legs. Although you'd be surprised some things I've found in wine. So as far as glasses go, there's a lot of different shapes out there. There's a lot of different options. You can go with these really expensive, nice hand-blown Riedels. You can do some, just machine-made, tasting glasses, depending on what you want. You could drink out of the bottle if you really felt like it. But yeah, so, again, you
shorter ones.
Yeah, there's tumblers that don't have necks. You got, stainless. So there's lots of different glasses. And you'll see some of these companies like Riedel on their website will show you different shapes for different types of wine.
What is the purpose of that?
Pretty cool. I mean, I'm sure it's marketing. I don't know. I don't make glasses. The science behind having a wide glass like this is when you pour the wine in it. Again, we've been talking about oxygen in wine. So the oxygen will actually soften the tannins in a wine. So sit like this. Basically, the surface area touching the air is a disc, if you will. It's a circle, right? Two-dimensional. It's just flat. When you swirl it like this, it becomes a cone. The cone opens up much more surface area than just the disc. So you get a little more oxygen to come. So you see people swirling their wine with your pinky out if you'd like. It's up to you. That allows kind of more of the volatilization of the aromas. It allows a little more oxygen to get into the wine, like I said. So it depends on.
So oxygen is bad in making, oxygen is good in drinking.
Correct. Like too much oxygen, even if you are drinking, like for example, I'm sure a lot of people have experienced this. When you leave a bottle on your sink overnight or for a couple days and you come back to it, or even in the refrigerator, it tastes a lot different than the moment you opened it. And that's because it's been oxidized. And you get to a point where it starts to turn into, ultimately the end result of oxidation of ethanol or alcohol is vinegar or acetic acid. So you can let it sit and sit and sit, and that's how they make vinegar. And red wine vinegar is basically wine that's just been sitting in the oxygen. They actually, in vinegar factories, will oxygenate it to increase that process. But yeah, so I think you don't want too much air in the bottle until you're ready to drink it. Then you start getting into those, fancy pourers that add oxygen with a Venturi valve and these kind of things, and decanters, for example. I'm always one of those people that, decanters are cool and they're fun, but the wine bottle is basically a decanter. So if you really want to air it, you put your thumb over it and shake it. It'll get some oxygen in there. Do that at home. Pour one glass out, shake it, pour in a second glass, and taste those two. And you'll see what I'm talking about with how air really interacts with the wine and how it changes it. So yeah, I mean, I think glass shape, that's great as long as it holds wine is my goal. But there are a few different shapes that allow for that disc to be larger. You'll see the tulip shapes. You'll see these are what's called Bordeaux glasses, have that kind of more, closed top, so you can really get a good swirl without spilling it on your, person next to you at the table. and just kind of allow it to open up a little bit. And again, people decant for hours or days. I've heard of people decanting it for days ahead of time.
But that's like a super old wine that's been laid down for a while. It really needs to open.
But see, to me, an old wine has already had its time to mature. So again, 100% of that is just personal preference and how you want to show it, at your presentation. But, once the wine kind of opens, you can smell the difference. And, sometimes you can swirl it and see how it's opening up, and you can smell it and then give it 10 minutes and smell it and give it 10 minutes and smell it. And then you'll see these changes in the aromas. And you can also smell it below or high because some of the smaller molecules evaporate faster than bigger molecules. So some of the lower stuff will stay low and the lighter stuff will go up to the top. So the difference between the top and the bottom is pretty cool to try out, for yourself. Some people do this. I think those people are ridiculous. The only reason I'd ever put my ear to a glass is when I'm taking it out of the barrel, I'm making sure that the ML, malolactic fermentation, is no longer occurring. And usually when it is, you'll hear it hissing, or if there's any primary fermentation still happening, you'll hear those bubbles popping. It'll sound carbonated like a soda or a beer. But
for the rest of us out of a bottle at the grocery store, we're not worrying about any of that.
Nah, open it, drink it. I don't think it's important to age a lot of stuff. Again, the wine, the people who collect, they age bottles that aren't ready to drink right off the bat. Most wines you buy in a store, the wine buyer at that store has chosen those bottles on purpose to be more approachable for tonight's dinner or this Thanksgiving or whatever your occasion is, again, a Tuesday night or a Saturday night. But yeah, there are wines out there that are meant to age, and I think that in general, over the course of winemaking history, those are fewer and farther between. I think most producers, number one, don't have space to store wine for you to allow it to be ready. And then number two, obviously I want to sell you something. So I want wine that I can sell you sooner than later. And so wines are made more to drink than they are to age at this point in time.
So like people will be swirling it and they'll be like, oh, look at those legs. What does that mean when people say that?
So legs, when you see that, they call them church windows in Germany. They call them tiers in France. We call them legs in America. But basically what that is the alcohol has evaporated and the water portion of the wine is dripping back down into the glass. So pretty much anything over 10% alcohol will do that. Go home and try that with a vodka or a tequila and you'll see that happen as well. But I don't think, a lot of people associate that with quality of some sort. I don't necessarily do personally, but it does show me there's alcohol in the wine, so that's cool.
That's all it shows?
In general.
Interesting.
Some people measure between them, if it's wider or if it's narrower. It's just a fun part of wine. I think it kind of gives it that romance, but I don't necessarily think it proves any quality association to it. But that's just me.
So the higher the alcohol, the more legs will show. So you have like a dessert port or something like that that's a higher alcohol, it's going to have big, thick legs?
Yeah, because of the sugar, the viscosity of the wine's much heavier, so that also dictates into it. But if I had a glass of water, I could show you. You could pour some wine in there or pour some water in there, dump that out, and then pour wine in there. You'll see the water just immediately go up the sides of the glass because the alcohol's taking it with it as it evaporates.
Oh, we can do that. Yeah. Yeah. So now we'll show with the water, what that does.
So explain that. This is just water. You see there's no legs. Just kind of makes spots like it came out of the dishwasher or whatever. So basically what I was saying is when the alcohol hits the water, it takes the water with it as the alcohol evaporates. You can kind of see already that the water is going up. But as soon as wine goes into there, you can really see it head up the sides. You see all that just happen?
Oh, weird.
So that's basically the water dripping back down the sides as the ethanol, the alcohol in the wine, is evaporating.
It's pushing it back up.
Makes legs.
Interesting. So it's not like a quality or anything like that. It's just showing the amount of alcohol. In the
again,
wine.
there's a whole school of people that'll probably hate me for saying it, but I don't think it does much. It just shows me there's alcohol in the wine, which is cool. But at the same time, like there's people out there that base their careers on telling you about how fancy wine is, and that's something that they point out to you.
What about like when they're like, oh, look at the color of this? What does that mean when people are talking about the color of a wine?
So, color, again, it's more personal preference than it is a quality association. I think, people think that a darker red wine means it's a more quality wine. Basically, the color in a red wine is from the anthocyanins in the skins of grapes. And so if you have a really, really dark wine, that means you probably left the grapes on the skins longer.
Or the type of variety, too.
And the type of variety as well. But yeah, so think about a good way to think about it is the size of the grape. So the smaller grapes like Cabernet or Petit Verdot or Petit Syrah, these grapes that have actually small berries on the vines, they have less juice and more skin. So the ratio of skin to juice is basically higher. So you get a darker, more extracted skin vibe, if you will, color or tannins from the skins. Something that has a big berry like a Malbec or a Merlot, it has more juice to skin, and so the ratio is kind of the other way around, and you get a juicier, lighter style, color. But one thing to think about when you're looking at color, and an easy way to look at it is hold it against something white. You want to notice the crown or the rim around the color, and if that has some browning to it, you're going to know this wine has been oxidized.
Cork in there.
Yeah, no, that's been bugging me the whole time. That'll stain. But anyway, so yeah, if you see a brown crown or a brick crown, you'll know that wine's either pretty old, which again indicates some oxygen intake to it, or it's probably been oxidized in general, and that's probably not something that you're going to taste. So having a nice clear crown, or at least a crown that matches the color of the wine internally, you're going to notice that it's more fresh and has a better fruit, quality to it.
So if someone gives you a brown red wine, you question that's probably not going to be good?
I mean,
or it's very old.
Still say thank you, but when you take it home, don't expect it to be phenomenal, because usually, like I said, it indicates oxygen is been introduced to the wine.
Interesting.
It's kind of like an apple that browns. It's literally the same polyphenol oxidase in white wine. In red wine, it's the same. Turns it brown. So
for you, being a winemaker, and this is your job every day, do you like wine?
I drink more scotch than wine, I would say. At least I would prefer to. It takes a lot of beer to make wine. That's always a saying that we joke around with. I do like wine, though. Yes, I do like wine. But I think for me, being surrounded by it, right, you don't get high on your own supply. It's not something that I choose to drink, or on my days off I go wine tasting. I think for me, I like to leave work at work, and but obviously everyone expects a wine from me for Christmas or when I come to dinners at people's homes, and so I do like wine. And I think for me, personally, just for my preference, I like wines I can chew on. I like these big, heavy, bold, tannic wines. But I also like to grill ribeye, so it kind of goes with the fat and the protein in the ribeye as well. So that, again, it's all personal preference, I think, when you're talking about the quality of a wine, because some people will like an acidic wine and some people won't. Some people will like a tannic wine and some people won't. So I think it just depends on you as a consumer, what you like, and stick to what you like, and don't be afraid to branch out, but don't be disappointed when you don't like something that you thought you might not like.
And you might not just like that year, that style, that vineyard, that winery, and you could have the same exact thing in a different flavor, or not flavor, but year, or from a different winery, and it might be fine. So
yeah,
you might have a bad Pinot, for instance, and then be like, I don't like Pinots, and you're like, well, have you tried all the Pinots in all the world?
Right. Yeah. So I'd say that to people who tell me I don't like Merlot. I'm like, why? Because you watched a movie, or do you not like Merlot because you've had a bad one? Have you not had a good one? Because the Merlots are amazing. But yeah, I mean, and we call that a vertical when we do a vertical tasting in the wine world. We do vintages that are consecutive. So, for example, 2019, 20, 21, 22, 23. They're all out of the same vineyard. They're all out of the same producer, hopefully the same winemaker. You can see that what Mother Nature did versus what the winemaker did. And as a winemaker, you try to make consistency, but that's not the name of the game. I think the fun with making wine is that one shot a year. And you think about these winemakers who are gurus and have these names and everyone recognizes them, and they've been making wine for 50 years. They've only made wine 50 times. You only get one shot of making wine per year. So if you were to tell me I only rode my bike 50 times and you were a good bike rider, I'd be like, that's pretty cool, because it takes a while to learn something, to learn a skill like that, especially when you have to wait a whole nother year to do it again. So I think, for me, it's like, if you're into consistency, drink Coca-Cola. Don't drink wine, because wine's not going to be that consistent. If you find a consistent wine, then, cool on the winemaker, but it's most likely going to be a blend, because you can blend in components that perhaps this particular year didn't give you, where it was too dry or something, or too wet, and you're not getting the ripeness. So you can blend, like, for example, something leaner into something heavy, or vice versa, something heavy into something leaner to give it some backbone. That way you can at least, the people that have brand recognition on your wines will say, I really like so-and-so. I usually buy their wines, and that's kind of what they do with that. But I personally love the differences between vintages. I think it makes wine more interesting.
Yeah, it's probably good for sales too.
I mean, people say, oh, this is a bad vintage or this is a good vintage, but in California, it varies a little bit, but not as much, not as drastically as other countries where it could be raining and sideways in October, and here it could be just hot and sunny. So it depends, but in general, yeah, I think it's kind of fun to see differences among vintages than it is to see consistency.
What do you think is going to happen in the wine industry? I know this year has been kind of difficult for a lot of people. There are, harvests that didn't even happen. Like, what are you seeing as a practitioner of the industry going?
That's a good question. I think the wine industry in general is kind of tapering a little bit, plateauing, if you will. I think that, the days, as we were talking about winemakers, the rock star winemakers that are existing and still exist are doing great. I think people that just sold their .com business, which isn't as common anymore, aren't able to buy these wineries. So you don't see as many of them. And I think that a lot of places that aren't sustainable, where they were based on big money in the beginning, the whole joke is if you want to make a fortune, take a fortune and buy a winery. Make a small fortune, you take a big fortune and buy a winery. I think that a lot of those are going away and people aren't as interested. And then you also see the younger kids these days are not drinking as much wine as they're drinking cocktails or and you also and you see in general people aren't even drinking alcohol. So it is a tough part of the wine, but it kind of it has those ups and downs and peaks and valleys and lulls and gluts and stuff. But wine's been made for thousands and thousands of years, and I don't think it's going to go away per se completely. But I think that it's going to go to the kind of Euro style where it's a condiment to go with your food. It's not something that's a luxury item or a fancy show off piece of jewelry, if you will. If you bring this such and such wine to the table, everyone goes ooh, they expect it to be something flamboyant and amazing, but it's just wine. It's just rotten grape juice. We don't there's a perceived value, I think, with those expensive bottles, but again, people will kill me for saying that. You do pay for some quality in some aspects, but when you're talking $1,000 bottle of wine, it's probably money to burn people that are drinking those mostly, or you've saved up and you drink that on your 50th birthday once in a lifetime. But yeah, I think in other countries, wine is just seen as part of your dinner.
Interesting. Yeah, and that's why it's nice, and not people get a little uppity about it sometimes, but it is just a nice thing to have. So for this week, we have a wine that Ben has made, and so Ben is going to do the wine talk for this week.
So this was a client of mine up in the Sierra foothills that I made wine for. Most of this goes to China, so you're probably not going to see it, but it's Sierra Sky is the name of the brand. This was actually a blend that we did. It's a Bordeaux blend. So there's a little cab. Well, it's mostly cab, but it's probably about 60. I don't honestly remember the exact ratios in this, but it's got a Cab, Merlot, Malbec, some Cab Franc, and I think a touch of Petit Verdot. So it has all five, but it's kind of a balanced blend. It's got a kind of a big structure, being a Bordeaux blend, and it's pretty approachable. This particular one's a 2019, so it's been around for a minute, but it still has to me some backbone and some structure to it. So this is a wine. I try to make wines that are drinkable and ageable, and that's a kind of a tightrope to walk, as we talked earlier. Usually wines, I think, have these days, I should say, have about a 10-year window. So they're young, and then after 10 years, I call them past their window. Again, personal preference. Some people love those kind of older, softer, you'll see these chunks at the bottom from polymerization of tannins and anthocyanin colors. But in a nice wine, this is pushing 5 years. I'm not seeing anything floating in it. There's nothing, besides that cork piece that was earlier, but this one's not going to have a big sediment in it. So
you're saying this client ships most of this overseas, which is interesting because we think about importing. We have the French wines and the Spanish wines and German wines and the kind of Australian wines, if you will, but we're now becoming exporters. So how is that working, or what is your experience with that?
I mean, again, I'm not a global economist, but apparently there's a big push in the middle class of China that are now being able to afford wine, and especially California wines, because California wines, as we've talked about, have a pretty easy approachability. Our weather is very cooperative for vineyards year in and year out. You don't see bad vintages except on rare occasions. So I think the Chinese folks are really enjoying having access to these wines. And this particular client of mine was from China, and he came and he partnered with an existing winery, and they decided that they wanted to do an export wine. And I will mention that making wine in the United States for the United States consumers have some leeway. We have some variability on ingredients that we're allowed legally to put in and not put in, and going to Europe or to China or just export in general, they narrow it down a lot more. So it has to be a little bit more pure, if you will. We're not allowed to add, some chemicals that I'm not trying to say that wines are full of chemicals in the U.S. That kind of came out wrong, but I think when you're making a wine to export, you really want it to be as clean and as pure as possible without having any outside influence on preservatives or any of those types of things.
So that's a good segue with that, where people get upset or like, I can't drink wine because I get a headache from the sulfites. And so what are we legally able to put into wine so people understand what we're actually consuming? Is it a bunch of chemicals? Because I think a lot of people think that.
No,
we have pesticides, we adulterate our food already in this country. Are we doing it with our wine as well?
Yes and no. Again, I think that's just our society and culture that have, allowed or tolerated I'm not sure what word to use, but that's accepted, I think, to, spray for molds and fungus or spray for bugs. But if you think back, 60, 75 years ago, that stuff didn't exist. So I don't know I don't want to call it a fad, but I think you'll see as we go forward in the future that these wines are going to go back to more traditional winemaking styles with, I'm not saying we're going to stomp them with our bare feet or anything like that, but I don't see the consumer obviously wanting chemicals in a wine. So I think you'll see a lot more label changes where if there are ingredients that are added. I personally think it should be mentioned on there. Like any other food I eat, I'm very conscious of what I put in my body, and for some reason wine has kind of slipped through the cracks on the FDA requirement to print what you've added. And there are some producers out there that are ahead of the curve and they're legally not required to, but they're putting on what they put in. For example, isinglass is used a lot in winemaking to fine those tannins down, but it comes from a sturgeon swim bladder. And so if you're a vegetarian or a vegan, that's probably not something you want to put in your body. There's things like sulfites you mentioned, and to on the label, if it says contains sulfite, it has to have 10 ppm or more. So when yeast is converting the sugar to alcohol, it actually produces a little bit of sulfite, and there's also a little bit of sulfur that goes into the vineyard just as elemental sulfur that you can spray. That's not a chemical, if you will, it's an actual element. So if you see that on the wine, don't let it throw you off. And I do hear a lot of people say, it gives me a headache if there's sulfur in the wine. And I'm not a doctor, so I don't know what's wrong with you. And I'm not saying take pills and drink wine, but a lot of that has to do with histamines. And I think that some people, I've offered the opinion that maybe try an antihistamine before you drink red, and like 9 out of 10 of those folks said, man, I can drink red wine again. So again, I'm not trying to,
give medical advice.
Encourage pill taking and pill popping and wine drinking at the same time, but people that say that are able to eat dried apricots, and dried apricots have hundreds of ppm of sulfur on them, where in general wine bottle has maybe 35 at the most, 40.
So if you've seen a wine bottle that does not have the label that says contains sulfites, it's probably good to go?
Yes and no. So sulfites is basically a preservative. So it's antioxidant and it's antibacterial and antifungal. So that's why we actually add it into the wine. And back in the Roman days, they would actually burn sulfur wicks in their barrels, and that's what would give the sulfur dioxide from the smoke into the wine. And they found that was actually, not only was it cleaning their barrel during the off season, but that was actually preserving the wines that they would add back into those barrels. So we've discovered, just actually using actual sulfur dioxide, whether it's a gas or a byproduct of potassium metabisulfite, will preserve these wines pretty much for very many years. When you see wines like in the organic wine industry, they're not allowed to add sulfites to the wines. Those wines don't have an incredible shelf life like you would think they would. So it's kind of hit or miss, and I mean, it depends. Again, if you're into being healthy and not having those types of things, then keep your eye out for organic wines and keep your eye out for low sulfite wines. But then there's also the kind of halfway mark where you'll see grown with organic or produced with organic grown grapes, but then we're adding sulfites to those to make the wine itself have a shelf life or an ageability, if you will. So again, it depends on personal preference. But back to your question about the ingredients and stuff, it's like, if we could say, what the ppm that we added, because there is a legal limit in the United States about how much you can add total, that would be kind of fun. I think that would probably change a lot of the wines that people are drinking, and they'd say, whoa, I can't believe there's that much in there. But again, it's just up to you what you like.
There's no transparency on the labels of that.
Unfortunately, no. And and there's not a thousand number list of what we add, there's basically, 5 or 10 things that are very common wine additives. But again, like I mentioned, isinglass is a good example. People that are vegan are not going to want to put that, but people that are vegan are not going to see that that's in their wine because nowhere on the label does it say contains isinglass.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the other additives that you add into wine?
Bentonite is a common one, mostly for whites, sometimes reds. It's a clay that's mined, and it basically has a charge of its own. It's a negatively charged clay, and it will bond to positively charged protein. So you'll see, I don't know if the average consumer has done this or not, but sometimes a white wine, when it warms up, will throw a protein haze. It'll look cloudy or foggy. So if you add bentonite, that'll take those proteins out. It's kind of like an egg yolk, or an egg white. They come clear out of the egg, but when you heat it up, it becomes white, opaque. Same thing's happening when you heat up these proteins in a wine, especially in a white wine where it's very, you can see it through a clear bottle. So we'll add bentonite to not have that happen.
Is that the same counterpart in Europe where they'll add the egg white? Or is that something completely different?
Both. So the egg white, also being a protein in itself, will bind to other proteins such as the tannins in the wine, and that's called fining. So when you fine a wine, you want to reduce the amount of tannin perception in your tongue, because your tongue and your gums are protein as well, and that tannin will bind, and people go, oh my, I have cotton mouth, my mouth is dry. As a winemaker, dry is a term more for how much sugar is in it. Astringency is the word we use for the perception of dryness. I kind of always equate it to a windshield wiper on not a wet window. It squeaks. Same thing happens to the roof of your mouth with your tongue, but that's a whole nother thing, which is, again, the sommeliers will tell you, bigger wines with bigger foods, same thing's happening. You put a piece of cheese or put a piece of meat in your mouth, which is also protein, the tannins now bind to that instead of your gums. The wine's smoother, the food's better. So that's a whole different interview, I think, with a somm than a winemaker. But so we can add, you can add egg whites, you can add isinglass, you can add bentonite, sulfur. There's a few things you can. You're in the United States, you cannot add sugar, but you can add acid. In Europe, you can't add sugar. You can't add acid, and you can add sugar. It's called chaptalization. But if you think of the climate in France versus the climate in Lodi, for example, Lodi is really warm, and as I mentioned earlier with the raisins as ripe as a grape gets, has a lot of sugar in it. In France, they might have this really nice warm summer, but it rains, and all of a sudden it's super cold by September. They're not going to get the ripening. Those sugars aren't going to get high. So they're allowed to add sugar to keep that alcohol level higher and what you would be used to in a bottle of wine, where we can't do that in the United States, at least not legally.
So to wrap this up, what are the recommendations, since we are coming to the holidays, that people should be looking into or getting for wine if they're unfamiliar with it?
I think, just in general, as we've kind of covered a little bit, just the body of the wine to the body of your food. And
Not
I think,
the artwork on the label.
You can't judge a book by its cover. I know we've all heard that one, but similar with wine. Yeah, there are some fancy names and some clever labels, but in general, and I think especially going into turkey season, where we're going to have cranberry sauce and we're going to have stuffing and all these kind of
prime rib or something
instead
of turkey.
I mean, some people cook all these big heavier meals, but in general, I find that Thanksgiving tends to be a little bit lighter, because turkey, ham, those types of things, unless you actually are doing a prime rib that's super fatty and super, red meat, most people are doing, kind of lighter fares. Pinot Noir is a good wine for Thanksgiving. Sangiovese or Chianti. Sangiovese is the Chianti grape from Italy. That's always a good food wine. Again, something lighter, I think, would pair well with Thanksgiving dinner versus, a porterhouse steak or something that, Cabernet would go to. But there's kind of the categories, right? So you got Bordeaux, which are Cab, Merlot, Cab Franc, Malbec, and Petit Verdot. You got the Rhônes in France, which are the Grenache, Syrah, Mourvèdre. Then you can go to Italy and you got the kind of lighter stuff, the Barbera and the Sangiovese. That kind of goes from heavy to lighter. It just, again, depends on your personal preference, but in general, to pair the body of your food with the body of the wine seems to work for me in my personal life. So
people shouldn't be afraid to show up to the grocery store when they're on their way to dinner and pick a $25 bottle, $15 bottle, and bring that as a gift.
Absolutely. And wine is always appreciated. I've never had anybody go, "Oh man, you brought wine." I mean, I've heard the wine again, because obviously that's what I do. But everybody's always happy with wine, whether they open it or not, or they drink it right then in front of you or share. That's up to them. But I think everybody loves Cabernet, so you're not going to go wrong with that. Even if you're having, fish tacos, Cabernet is still a good wine because everybody loves Cab. But I think people take that and worry too much about it. And I think that's, as long as you're drinking wine and you're enjoying it and it puts a smile on your face and you feel fine and you feel fuzzy and warm and good, then that's what it's for. It's doing its job.
Well, thank you so much for being here and explaining wine to us. I'm sure we'll have you back on to talk about other topics.
My pleasure.
And again, when you think of death, think of me. Thank you for listening to this podcast. If you found value, please like, subscribe, and share. And be sure to follow me on all the socials at Sips and Tips with Lindsay. And of course, you can always go to my website, sipsandtipswithlindsay.com, to find more information about estate planning, business, snowboard, travel, and of course, wine. As always, we have to get the legal stuff out of the way. I went to law school, so you don't have to. However, we have to read the special disclaimer that I am not a practicing attorney. I am not your attorney. I am not offering any legal advice in any content or any episode. All content is for your information and educational purposes only. It is not a substitute for seeking your own legal advice from your own attorney or other professionals such as a CPA or financial advisor. I cannot give legal advice and do not offer any legal services or legal advice, but I do offer some fun and educational content for you to enjoy.